Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today I am joined by the wonderful Eiynah, Nice Mangoes on Twitter, and host of the absolutely wonderful podcast Polite Conversations, and the ongoing mini-series within that called Woking Up, where she dissects some of the more repugnant and regressive views of Sam Harris and the rest of the IDW intellectual dark web, rational genius brain, far-right adjacent weirdos and just awful people that inhabit that space. I've been a fan of Eiynah's for a little while now, and she does absolutely wonderful work in this space. She, as we talk about in the episode, goes to great lengths to back up her claims with citations from the people that she's criticizing. She's much better about that than I am, whereas I will just simply talk endless shit about people. Eiynah actually brings the receipts and the evidence, and I respect her very much for that. And I was very happy to get her on the show to have this conversation. If you're not familiar with the space and the people that we're describing, hopefully this episode will serve as kind of an introduction to you for what New Atheism was and kind of what it eventually turned into in respect to the public intellectual community and how that ultimately became a very regressive force in our world, particularly in the Western political space, and how this group of public intellectuals have sort of spearheaded the introduction of some very deeply regressive and far-right agendas and talking points and positions into what is now the mainstream of Western politics, and how they go about propagandizing in that fashion and masking these views, obfuscating them behind a thin veneer of liberal values. If you want a deeper dive on the subject than what we go into here, which we only kind of cover the surface level stuff and do a bit of an introduction to the subject matter at hand, I would highly recommend that you go subscribe to Eiynah on Twitter and that you go out and listen to her podcast. She puts in a lot of time and energy and effort into making those, and they're absolutely worth your time if this is something that you're interested in. I can't say enough good things about her or her work, so definitely go check her out. As far as content warnings go, we're talking about the Big Brain Rational Boys Club, so as always, there's going to be Islamophobia, there's going to be just all the regressive shit that comes associated with that, so I think we talk about homophobia, transphobia, racism, race and IQ stuff, all the big things that assholes like to spend their time talking about on Twitter. We hit pretty much all of them. If that is going to cause you psychic damage, you know the drill. Won't take it personally if you skip this one. For everybody else, I will see you after the jump, and I will not keep you from the interview any longer. And I give you Eiynah, Nice Mangoes. Eiynah, Nice Mangoes, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So you are the host of the Polite Conversations podcast, which is excellent. And you also have like a mini podcast embedded within that called the Woking Up podcast, which is, would you describe it as like a mini series, or how would you?
Yep, definitely a mini series. And it is focused on kind of my journey into and out of New Atheism, and specifically into and out of being a Sam Harris fan.
Yeah. And I think you and I, we talked about before we started recording, have somewhat similar experiences there. At least they intersect at several points. But I want to just get your sort of origin story and how you came to be what I have started to think of you as Sam Harris's, like, you're like an unwilling biographer of all the man's fuck ups. um, which you do actually like excellent work. Like you're like the level of scholarship that you put into pointing out just how much of a shitbag this guy is like nothing short of amazing. But I am curious, and I'm sure my listeners are curious, just how you came to the point where you're doing this.
Um, well, I guess it has a lot to do with my own new atheist phase. And I think growing up in a theocracy is something that leaves you vulnerable to these kinds of movements.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Saudi Arabia, where being a woman and just religion was so, something so oppressive. It's in every aspect of life. Like you just simply cannot escape religion in Saudi, even though I was fortunate that not being an actual Saudi, my background is Pakistani. So we, like, the expats in Saudi Arabia, kind of live separately for the most part. So we do have, like, compounds for foreigners, and Saudis weren't allowed into our compound, and our schools were different from Saudis. So in a large way, I guess we were fortunate to escape things like morality police for large chunks of time. But of course, that doesn't mean that you escape it forever. So every day when we would leave the compound, either to go get groceries or go to school or whatever, morality police, like literal morality police, was always a concern. And so being a woman in that environment where you are made by the state to wear a black cloak and cover your hair, and it just builds up a whole bunch of resentment, within
Mm-hmm.
you. So I guess when I got out, just being free to express my criticism of religion and disbelief and all of that just felt so cathartic. And I guess the pent up anger left me to be a prime candidate for uh, new atheism, and that is another cringe phase in my life. But because I feel kind of guilty about it, that is why I put in the work to document some of this stuff so that maybe others can learn from my experiences.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this with Dave from Echoplex,
Hmm.
and the the origins of like the writing was pretty much always on the wall when it comes to new atheism. I just think because I got wrapped up in that movement as well, and it's in hindsight, it probably should have been obvious to all of us, but it just wasn't
Yeah.
until I think like Elevator Gate was the tipping point for a lot of people, and then the foreign policy positions of a number
Mm.
of those folks. But
Yeah, I think it being kind of positioned as being, against Bush era
mhm,
Christianity and stuff made it feel a little more progressive, even though the foreign policy stuff was very neocon.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when you look back on it, it very much was just like a collection of like edgelord contrarians, and
Mm,
like that was really the moral center of new atheism. It wasn't um, people who were evangelical about atheism. It was people who were just career contrarians who happened to be atheist, and their primary focus was and for the people that were successful was making money by thumbing their nose at whatever was the status quo at the time. And we've more or less, potentially to their credit, probably not, sort of, it's pretty, we've gotten a beachhead against like evangelical Christianity, and it's not cool to be against Christianity anymore. You got to find something else to be a contrarian about. And so that's the direction they've gone in, is being deeply regressive against social progress.
I mean, I would argue that they were always very pro status quo,
Hmm.
while feeling that they are
Yeah.
transgressive in a way. But
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's definitely a deep misogyny streak and a deep, sort of abiding respect for American imperialism in there
mhm,
for sure.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough thing to tease out, right? Like there's so many different players and so many different like positions but it's just this nexus of just suck, right?
Oh, for
That,
sure. The
um,
mother lode of bad ideas, as
yeah.
someone once said.
Yeah. So how did, that's how you found yourself as sort of involved in that community. What was it that sort of broke you out of that? Like, how did you, and maybe for the folks that aren't so familiar with this, because you and I both spend a lot of time dealing with these or thinking about these people, like the new atheist movement, we'll just describe, was spearheaded by like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and a bunch of edgelords who spend most of their time debating priests and like angry Republicans and saying really regressive shit about Islam. Uh, and that's, I think most people will have a passing familiarity with that. But how did you find yourself kind of moving out of it? What was the thing that spun you?
Yeah, I guess it was the fact that my atheism was always informed by my progressive values, and just having a wider lens on the atheist community online just started to become apparent that this was not at all the progressive secular humanist movement that it claimed to be. It did not care for minorities. It, in fact, just brought up all the same bigotries that I wanted to leave behind with leaving religion behind. And it just sort of put a secular, rational, sciencey spin on them, you know? So when things like the Syrian migrant crisis happened, like it became
Mm,
so apparent that these people were very anti-immigrant, anti-migrant, and pushing far-right propaganda on many, many an occasion. And for a while, I tried to tell myself that maybe it wasn't like intentional, maybe it was just an accident. But then when I started like probing into these things and talking to people about it, it just became so obvious that it was very much intentional. They knew what they were doing, and they just liked it.
yeah, I do often like I wonder, right? Because we're living in the world of 2022. We're now in a place where Tucker Carlson, the most popular cable news host in our country, or in my country anyway,
Mm.
is
Yeah, not my country.
yeah. I'll take the blame for Tucker.
But
Uh,
to be fair, we have plenty of our own
yeah,
hideous, horrendous extremists. We are the country of Jordan Peterson, Lauren Southern,
uh,
Stefan
yeah.
Molyneux. So I do not want to excuse that either. But yeah, continue.
But I'll shoulder the burden of Tucker. But the most popular cable television news host in my country is openly like like openly reading the talking points for like the great replacement conspiracy theory.
Yeah, for
Like
sure.
he's literally like a hair's breadth away from being an open white nationalist. Like he just, for want of one or two words,
Yep.
is openly a white nationalist. And if you listen to all the things Tucker Carlson says, and that is now like sort of the default party line
Mm.
for the Republican Party for the most part. Like if you're not a white nationalist and a near open one in the Republican Party, you're not going to get elected in a lot of states.
Hmm.
And if you listen to the line that is the through line for that group of thought, it tracks very naturally. It maps very cleanly onto many of the things that were being said in the early to mid aughts by the new atheist movement as they were describing foreign policy. Like you hear the early whispers of that being sort of shoehorned into progressive or what were ostensibly progressive movements were supposed to be. And I wonder how much of what we're seeing now in terms of the normalization and mainstreaming of the alt-right is a direct result of people like Harris and the new atheist movement.
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies and papers talking about how the IDW do a lot of on-ramping for further right people. And yeah, I mean, it's obvious when you look at it that that world is a stepping stone into the further right world, right? They take those same points, they scrub them up a little bit, they launder them and make them more palatable and acceptable sounding. And that's just kind of like how people get started. And then they start to perhaps seek more and more extreme content. But like this kind of great replacement stuff, like Harris himself has published extremely Alex Jonesian numbers about Muslim birth rates, where Muslims were going to be majority in France in some ridiculously short number of years, and it was going to cause a civil war, and it was just absurd. It was absurd. And he won't even admit now that he was wrong to use those kinds of numbers. Like after the Christchurch massacre, I think several people pointed out to him online that kind of Muslimic birth rates and all of that kind of fear mongering was exactly what was on that manifesto too. And does he regret saying things like that? No, he doesn't take any of that back. That's what is the absolute worst. Like he will not acknowledge, or maybe he doesn't even think it's bad, you know? It's not just that he's instinctively doubling down. Maybe he truly thinks that's okay. It's not his responsibility, even though he's publishing those numbers. He says he makes excuses like, "Oh, well, I got it off this book," or "What? I'm not a demographer. Or how could I have known?" It's like, dude, what kind of excuse is that? I'm not a demographer, but I can tell you that I thought that was pretty nuts when I saw it.
Yeah, and then you combine that with the kid glove treatment of people like, say, Douglas Murray, who Sam has. I can't remember the numerous positive things that he said about Douglas Murray, but he's
called
like
him impeccable and just awful.
And then like you read Douglas and that it's the similar to like the Joe Rogan effect, right? Like Sam will bring on somebody who has these really odious beliefs and views and be they'll be allowed to present themselves in sort of the nicer, more liberal friendly version of themselves while still saying some pretty fucked up stuff. And then you go over to their information stream, their platform, like you read Douglas Murray's column or any of his books, and it's, he's basically Tucker Carlson with an accent and a stick up his ass. Like he's just, he's like this erudite, like tie too tight asshole. But at the end of the day, he's, a deeply reactionary person.
Yeah. And also like more gullible people will just think, oh, well, Mr. Fancy neuroscientist approves of this guy, so he must be all right.
So I guess this is a good spot to sort of get your take on this, because your take is far more informed and more nuanced, and like you have more experience with this than I do. With the way Sam does what it is that he does in terms of laundering far-right talking points and figures and sort of mainstreaming them. Like he has a specific technique and way about it that it's if you're not intimately familiar with his content, it's very easy to miss. But if you do spend a lot of time listening to him and you are familiar with the arguments that he makes and the ways that he says things, it becomes much more clear with that exposure. And that is one of the reasons that I like your show, is you are in very clear terms, you point out what he's doing when he's doing it, because you have that frame of reference. Excuse me. But Maybe you could sort of give an overview for those who are not so familiar with Sam. Maybe they've heard some clips of his. Maybe they follow him on Twitter. They don't quite understand what it is that he's doing. And like, how do Sam?
Well, I guess the best way to describe it is that he is intentionally slippery. And you will probably see that with a lot of IDW figures. Like, they don't like to be pinned down to their positions. So they add a lot of caveats and a lot of waffling and speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Or something Sam likes to do a lot is either promote someone that is far right or downplay their harmfulness. But then when immediately he will kind of backtrack and be like, well, I don't know enough about this person, so I could be wrong, but how can Milo be far right when he is gay and Jewish? And, nothing I've heard him say is even remotely right wing. He's so flamboyant, like as if one thing has any bearing on the other. Like, you can be flamboyant and gay and also promote far right talking points. Like, for someone who doesn't like identity politics, he sure loves to throw identity politics in there to defend these types of people, like Eiynah also, who is incredibly reactionary, a Trump defender, a Kavanaugh defender. And her latest book is about how Black and brown migrant men are coming to Europe to rape white women. And it's called Prey, Prey. So yeah, she's
good. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, she is awful.
Very subtle.
Incredibly subtle, yes. And Sam likes to defend her always by saying, well, she is this Black Somali woman. She should have been a hero of the left. And yet there are these privileged white women that snicker and walk away when she's given a talk about how Me Too went too far or something like that. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, but her skin color really has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that actually is that's a very good point that Sam has as his fallback in many instances what I view as something of a hallmark of right-wing ideologues, which is reposing on the shallowest version of identity politics possible, while at the same time decrying identity politics. Right? It's not that, like, he's literally endorsing deference epistemology while claiming that standpoint epistemology is going to be the end of Western civilization, right? Like, you should be celebrating Ayaan Hirsi Ali because she's a black Somali Muslim woman. But if you dare, ex-Muslim, my apologies, you should be heralding her as like this, liberal, this amazing liberal person. But if you suggest that perhaps we should ask people who are demographically exposed to information about how they're being mistreated systemically, like, if we were to include Black Americans in the conversation about how American policing disproportionately disenfranchises them, whoa, that's wokeness.
And this is a trick that, Dave Rubin has used all along. One thing I like to say about the entire IDW is that it is a set of Dave Rubin nesting dolls. So
yeah,
you'll
that's
see
good. I like that.
Different degrees and different shades of that kind of bullshit, but it is all the Dave Rubin grift again and again and again and again.
Rubin is an interesting character. Rubin was actually not to his credit, but like Rubin was sort of the fulcrum around which I spun in terms of like realizing that all these people were full of shit, because his grift was so transparent.
Right. He kind of did ruin it for a lot of them.
Yeah, and so like my whole like new atheism experience was like I was in high school when they were mostly popular, and like I read like some Dawkins and some Hitchens,
Mm.
and I was your standard like edgy high
Mm-hmm.
school atheist. And then I spent like 12 years essentially just drunk and not paying attention to anything whatsoever. I was completely unengaged.
Mm.
And then in like 2015, 2016, I like got my shit together, and I was newly sober, and I was thirsty for information about the world around me. And
Mm.
I went back to my roots, and I was like, oh, Sam Harris has a podcast now. Oh, who's this Jordan Peterson guy? And like, I was basically the perfect candidate to get sucked in
Mm.
to their little like self-help guru shit.
Mm. Mm.
And I found myself over the course of like 2015 and 2016 listening to the backlog of all of Harris's podcasts and all of the rest of these IDW folks, and watching in real time as what they were saying was directly contributing to like the rise of the alt-right, and like watching Rubin's grift fall apart in real time. And so like I basically got all of the 2010s new atheist merging with the alt-right stuff in
Mm.
the space of like a year.
Did
And
you just say the naughty word merge?
yeah, I did.
You are not. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't do that because it is haram. You simply
Yeah.
cannot mention the word merge because people get upset.
Yeah. I don't know if merge is even an accurate word. Like, I mean, they're basically just like holding hands and skipping down the road together at this point, right? Like, like I really have a hard time telling a difference. Like everybody who was a sort of an acolyte of new atheism that is not, a white nationalist at this point is just openly critical of the people that were new atheists. So like you're either like, I think this happened to like, what was it? What's their name? Is it Myth-Informed Mike
Yeah,
on
yeah,
YouTube? Yeah.
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 Myth Informed Milwaukee was the event or something.
Yeah. It's
And
just so like, God damn.
yeah, just their latest. I mean, it's not even just their latest poster, though. I think it's always been like a Pepe fest, really. And now they're just having like Lauren Southern and James Lindsay and yeah, just embarrassing stuff happening.
And yeah, Lauren Southern is, yeah, like I don't. This might be getting too into the drama thing, and you tell me if it is. But when you have Ben Burgess and Lauren Southern at the same convention, like I don't know what else to call that other than a merge.
I mean, I don't even know if Ben Burgess is an atheist, but there's others on that poster that are, and the whole event is right. It's like an atheist event, and yeah, I mean, I don't know Ben Burgess's religious affiliation, but yeah, my only exposure to him online has been his awful, awful IDW-esque takes. So it's not that I'm disappointed in him because I didn't really know him. And what I have seen of him has been.
Yeah, I think and this is probably where I would put Ben on the spectrum of this is there has always been a seat at the table at the reactionary table for anybody who blindly defends the most reductive version of free speech possible, because at a minimum that person is useful to their ends, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're a Nazi, you're going to support somebody who says that there should absolutely be no limits whatsoever on speech under any circumstances because that benefits you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, even just the general right will always embrace a so-called left person if they're there to confirm all their talking points about how wokeness has gone too far and pronouns are concerning and free speech and all that. Like, of course, they're going to love that. So, yeah, you'll go places with that.
Yeah, there's a
Not
lot
any
of
place
money to be
good,
made in it.
but
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, you'll definitely get some clout. You'll get some money, and book deals perhaps.
It's
An
just,
appearance on Joe Rogan, even. Hey,
yeah.
to promote your book about how canceling comedians is so bad.
Yeah. I have such a very dim view of that whole discourse because, there is a charitable reading of the point of we should have open, free discussion. There's a charitable way to read that, which is, if we put people in charge of determining who has access to speech, like who is allowed to say what, it becomes problematic very quickly when we decide, who gets to decide, right?
Yeah, but that's like such a slippery slope argument, right? Like
Yeah.
we always have had limits, and everyone
Mhm.
always has had limits. You can't promote violence. Most people
Mhm.
agree with that. You can't promote inappropriate stuff about children. I think everyone agrees with that. And now we're in a pandemic, and I think most people do agree that promoting medical misinformation is extremely dangerous in this climate.
Yeah, there's that, and then I agree with what you just said, but my primary criticism of that argument is kind of a more material one, in like the Marxist sense, which is who watches the Watchmen is
Mm.
a reasonably good point to consider, right? It's something we should onboard and think about, but we
Mm-hmm.
should also be skeptical of calls for that to be put into action when the people who are asking who watch the Watchmen
Are
are the
right
people
wingers? Yeah.
who people who financially are invested in having the watchtowers built, right?
Right,
like
right,
if you,
right.
yeah, so it's not that it's a bad argument necessarily, it's who is making it and why. And that, I think, gets, like, with people like Burgess, my primary complaint is that they're not considering that when they make their arguments. Like, we've never had free and unlimited access to speech. Like, I consider the fact that, Tucker Carlson has a megaphone to hundreds of millions of people and like an extra speech act on top of mine, right? He gets money to amplify his
Mm-hmm,
voice.
mm-hmm.
Why don't we talk about who gets their voices amplified rather than who gets the amplification taken away? You're not guaranteed a right to have your views promoted. You're guaranteed not to be thrown in prison for expressing them.
Right. And this recent New York Times editorial about cancel culture or free speech or whatever is so ridiculous when there are so many laws actually targeting books and school curriculums and teachers and like serious speech being impacted here. And they are kind of both sidesing it with people, feel like they have to hold their tongue when, so that they aren't ridiculed. And it's like, what? Like, when did that become a thing about free speech? Like, that's not about free speech at all. People always have had to think about what they're saying. To be free of ridicule and shaming has never been like something that you're guaranteed or entitled to just because you have free speech. Sure, you can say your thing, but then people are entitled to react to it.
Yeah, I mean, we have never guaranteed freedom from social repercussions for something
Mm-hmm.
that someone says. We've guaranteed that you will not be accosted by
The state?
yeah, like you're not going to get thrown into prison for saying something. That's it. That's the only guarantee you have. And they're even going a step further and than anything. It's like they're asserting almost that they have the right to say literally anything, anywhere, under any circumstances, and not have somebody tell them that it makes them feel bad.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you don't even you're not even allowed to criticize speech. So you're limiting speech in that effect right away.
Exactly. I remember when the whole New Atheist line was about ridiculing bad ideas, and now it's about protecting conservative feelings.
Yeah, well, God knows we have to care about them more than facts. Like we have. It is a very interesting turn of events where we have the free speech warriors talking about how people who are making tens, hundreds of millions of dollars performing speech acts who feel that they're not getting the extra amount of money that they would if so you have performers who their material is no longer widely palatable and people are refusing to spend money actively on them, decrying that their free speech is being infringed because people are choosing to voluntarily withhold their ascension to their speech with their money. Meanwhile, like you said, we have the actual state actually banning historical works about oppression in the country based on racial oppression, and nobody's talking about that. And it's just so obviously transparent that their interest is not actually in free speech. Their interest is in accumulating power for their own interests. And this is just a smokescreen.
Yeah. And it's just now that sort of everyone can have a voice through social media, that people's opinions, people ridiculing people or shaming people has become a problem for them, because otherwise no one had any issues ridiculing, especially in the new atheist scene, ridiculing religious ideas or Islamists or whatever. But now when it's the lens is pointed at Western right-wingers, and suddenly we have to be walking on eggshells and just extra cautious not to hurt anyone's feelings or not to make them feel like they need to hold back on whatever they want to say. It's come on. I remember when the same people who are fighting for Ben Shapiro's right to say whatever he wants on campus, or Richard Spencer's right to say whatever he wants on a campus, were, asking for some sort of Muslim conservative to be deplatformed from a university in the UK. And, I was like, yeah, why should that conservative guy go preaching this shit at a university? I was on board with that too. He doesn't need a platform. But now that the lens is turned towards Western conservatives, no, don't deplatform our conservatives. It's just such a striking contrast to how the conversation was framed in my online circles just a while ago, just 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. I'm kind of two minds about that phenomenon. I think that there's two primary poles of ideology that's animating it, and they're sort of the streams get crossed, and it's sometimes hard to tease out which is which. But on the one hand, you have just straight up right-wing grifters who are will promote freedom of speech for as long as it's useful to us, and then we won't. And it's very obvious what's going on there. They'll cozy up to folks like Pinker and them, who are your liberals who will. I don't have a very high opinion of Pinker, but I think fundamentally he's just an out of touch liberal who thinks he's smarter than everybody around him. And I don't think he's as nefarious as some of these other people, even if the consequences of his actions are. And then
not as, but he is pretty fucking bad. I mean, he defended Jeffrey Epstein. He helped
Yeah.
write a letter to defend him. He minimized rape and cited like hardcore like MRAs and shady people as his sources. Like, so he's
I'm not defending Pinker. Like, I don't think he's like a good dude. I'm happy to throw him out with the bathwater. But I do think that there's like a categorical difference between him and say somebody like I don't know, Eric Weinstein, right? Like somebody who's like clearly grifting.
Yeah, he's less bad among the bad people.
Yeah. And then that's sort of like my point is that I think Pinker represents or is party to this other pole of influence, which is just the degradation of liberalism. And, you know, I think liberalism very historically has often like ceded room to reactionary movements, primarily out of, you know, a staunch in defense of its own principles in a very myopic way and a very like head in the clouds kind of idea that, you know, as long as we defend the stalwart, valiant core of liberal ideas, that things will work out fine in the end because it's the right thing to do. And then there's people who genuinely believe that to some degree or another, and that's animating it. And then there's the right wingers who ape that language and do so cynically. And it's hard to tell who's who, and there's a lot of overlap. But I think those are two separate poles of the situation. And it's hard to tell where people fall on it, I think. Yeah, actually, like I would be interested in your opinion on that because I know that you have like a fairly withering opinion of a lot of those folks. I would just be curious, like what you think about.
Can you specify your two poles again?
So you have on the one hand, we'll start with like liberalism, like classical liberalism, and
classical liberalism, as in the Dave Rubin kind.
No, classical liberalism is in like you know, like Locke and Rousseau and like actually like people who,
okay.
Yeah. And the political traditions which have come down from that historically when they are confronted with a fascist movement tend to side with the fascists over leftists, for instance, because the fascists at least ape the language of liberalism, and they're at least amenable to like free markets and what have you, until they get in power. And I think liberals are acutely vulnerable to falling prey to right-wing ideology because the other group involved in this is actual hardline right-wingers who are aping the language of liberals to cozy up to them. And so it's hard to tease the difference out between these two people sometimes because
I would argue that it's a bit of a trap to get too involved in trying to tease out the difference between liberals who cozy up to right-wingers and right-wingers who cozy up to liberals, because the actual thing that matters, I mean, we can't know what's in each and everyone's hearts, right?
Yeah.
Where their loyalties and their ideologies lie exactly, and what they're presenting to us. So I would say that really all we can judge them on is what they put out into the world. And if that is in effect aiding the right and the far right and carrying water for the right and bashing the left all the fucking time, then they are at best just useful idiots for the right, and at worst just people who want to sanitize and bring a right-wing agenda forward.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to that, like that very consequentialist reading of it. I think that when it comes to how we behave in the world in terms of reacting to this sort of stuff, I think that's absolutely the correct line to take. It's not useful to get wrapped around the axle debating whether or not somebody in their heart of hearts is, an actual liberal who's been taken advantage of, or they're, a closeted Nazi. Like, we can't, like you said, we can't actually know. And all we can really judge is the effects of their words and actions. But I do think that there is some level of utility in trying to understand why some of the more moderate voices in that movement do the things that they do.
In the IDW, you mean?
Yeah. And the reason that I think it's useful to try and understand their motives is because it is helpful to counteract their behavior if I can understand what they're doing. Like if there's somebody who actually has good intentions, then I don't know. I think it can be useful to understand why people do what they do if my goal is to prevent them from doing those things.
Sure.
Yeah.
But so who are the moderate IDWers
in my view, I would say Pinker probably would be one of the more moderate ones. And then a few years ago. Yeah, no, fair enough. That is a good point. Well taken. Well taken.
And so also, let me point out about Pinker is that he is what? A race and IQ guy, a Quillette promoter, Jeffrey Epstein letter writing defender, rape minimizer.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is maybe moderate for the IDW, but it's pretty fucking awful.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of
and I'm
him.
saying this as someone who doesn't even I don't even focus on Pinker, so I don't even know that much about him. So this is just from my sort of surface encounters with Pinker content, my focus has been on other more insidious members of the IDW. But
I mean, it's possible that I'm completely incorrect about that.
No, I'm not saying that you are. I'm just saying that if that is the moderate side of things, then that is pretty fucking bad as well.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. And so, so let's try to understand why he may be doing that. Why do you think?
Well, I think I can't mind read, but I think that he and people who are fans of his do the things that they do are motivated primarily by trying to, they're neoliberals or they're liberals. They're trying to maintain the status quo, right? They're status quo warriors rather than absolute regressives.
Pinker is a big time status quo warrior in my mind.
So maybe that's a better way of phrasing it, is that I think there might be some utility in identifying who is an advocate for the status quo versus who is an absolute regressive whose motive is to completely take us back to, the ye olden times of only white men owning property.
I think much of the IDW is they are regressive in the way that they think, of course, and they do fight progress pretty actively. But I don't think they're the level of regressive caveman that Jordan Peterson is, for example. I think Jordan Peterson is more regressive than the rest of them. But that doesn't make them any less harmful. You know what I mean? So Sam Harris may be okay with men and women working together, which Peterson isn't. But that doesn't mean that his views on feminism and Me Too going too far and race and IQ and Muslimic birth rates and stuff are any less harmful than Jordan Peterson's enforced monogamy or whatever regressive bullshit.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to agree, right? I think that you're probably almost certainly correct in the consequential is just taking it all as what is the actual effect of what these people are saying and evaluating it along those lines. I do have a bit of the white boy edgelord, let me think about this thing that doesn't actually affect me, intellectualize it disease that is a symptom of some of the folks that were in the new atheist movement. So that might be what I'm trying to do here, is just sort of play with it.
I mean, I'm not immune to that
Yeah.
either. Like I've been there. I get that totally.
Yeah.
But in effect, they all suck.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, they if those of you listening, if you take anything away from this conversation, it's they all suck. It's just we're hashing out the details of to what degree and why.
Yeah.
So I think that's the main takeaway is, and I'm somebody who, and let me couch everything that I have just said in the statement that I think liberalism is a regressive ideology. So, like, when I call somebody a liberal, that is not me defending them.
Yeah, no, see, I think that also is a confusing, because it means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So I know where you're coming from, but I also see that these guys are very attached to the label liberal, and to them it means like someone that is, leftish and, not right wing. And whereas to you, it might mean very well that they could be right wing. So I feel like liberal can be an unhelpful word sometimes because it means so many different things to so many people.
I had a conversation with a friend of mine about this very recently, where we were talking about like who's a liberal versus who's a conservative, and I know you personally have run into a lot of trouble with like characterizing Sam as a conservative.
No, it's not that I've run into trouble. It's that people just want to keep their blinders on.
Yeah. No, maybe that is probably a poor way to phrase it. People have attacked you for accurately pointing out that Sam Harris is deeply regressive on a number of issues, and you've used, if I'm not mistaken, the label of conservative to describe him.
Right wing.
Right wing. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I'm kind of at the point where I don't actually know if I think there's any utility left in American politics for using like it liberal or conservative or what have you. They really functionally are, like you said, kind of smoke screens for a lot of bad ideas. And I don't know, actually, I'm very interested in your thoughts on the whole, like, who do we call a liberal? Who do we call right wing? Why do we call them that? Like, how do you frame those words in your mind when you're talking about people?
So this is why I don't use liberal so often, because to some people it's a huge compliment. That's what prevents them from being right wing. And to some people it's like, oh yeah, you're a liberal, and that's an insult. You're obviously right wing and not a leftist like me. So I just tend not to use it because I don't think that people should be able to self-identify despite being extreme sort of great replacement launderers as liberal, which is what they want. Even though some leftists may think liberal is fine because, yeah, liberals can be right wing. I just don't think that we should play the game on their terms. Like that was Dave Rubin's big thing. Like he was the last liberal, right? And he used that term to muddy the water all the time. He wasn't like, he's nothing but like a far right grifter. That is what he is. And to let him self-identify as liberal is a mistake. Like, I mean, I don't ask people if they're Islamists, right? And extremists don't often self-identify as that way. So if someone has a concerning ideology, I'm not going to wait for them to tell me that, hey, I'm a white nationalist, or I'm a racist, or, like people like Sam Harris always think that like racism has to be, or at least that's how his content makes it seem, is that racism has to be purposeful and, something that you intentionally do and like planned, and, it has to be like KKK-esque. And no, well, racism can come in many different forms and intensities. And so liberal, I think it's a kind of a problematic. I don't like it.
Yeah, fair enough. I would, I think I've probably would use the word progressive more. Is the I think when most people who are, to the left of Reuben use the word people who are to the left of Reuben and to the right of me use the word liberal, they generally mean it in a positive connotation. And I think what they very often mean is socially progressive. And I think that's probably a better term. Because like you said, yeah, I think liberalism as a word, as you said, has more or less lost all meaning in the Western political discourse. And I'm actually tempted to say the same thing of conservatism as well. To a certain, it's not quite as bad, but like I think that term's gotten flattened down so much that like it has lost all utility.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I just use right wing. Like,
Yeah.
it's clearer, I think. Though these guys do kind of embody the classic point of wanting to look back on a time, a golden age where things were better. Like, they'll say like 10 years ago, wokeism wasn't this bad. However, I was watching them 10 years ago and they were saying the exact same thing, except they were using political correctness, or SJWs. Every 10 years, they have just like the same rehashed conversation with different terms.
Yeah, and I mean, in that respect, I think they're accurately, many of them are accurately characterized as conservatives, in specifically that way, and that is dangerous, right? Like the heart. Anytime somebody is telling you that things were better 10 years ago, when I hear that, like something along those lines of like, this wouldn't have been a problem 10 years ago, or et cetera, et cetera. I hear that almost with the same level of shudder in my bones as I hear when somebody says, please think of the children. Like I know that person is about to try to sell me on some of the most regressive shit that I will have heard in a very long time. I think we're coming up on the time that you said that you had, so I'm mindful of that. If you were to somebody has never heard of the IDW, they've never heard of Sam Harris or any of these people. Like if you could meet such a blissful person who's lived that kind of a life, and they're coming onto Twitter and they're coming into this space where people are having these conversations in real time about, foreign policy and trans rights and eugenics and all this stuff, this information cesspool that we both live in, what would you say to those people about this group of people and how to like navigate that? Like, what's your advice to them?
Ooh, I mean, well, first, even to identify that you're among those people is tricky because they don't use labels like, oh, I'm conservative or, I'm right wing, and they resist being pinned down to such things. So I would just say keep an eye out for certain talking points, right? And if there's enough red flags, look into their views, and you will most likely find that they are regressive on many topics.
Good deal. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover or talk about at length before we plug your stuff?
I saw that you listened to Sam Harris's episode on Rogan.
Yeah.
And I think you found it as amusing as I did. I saw your thread on that, so that was funny.
Yeah, Jesus fucking Christ, that fucking episode. So I hadn't listened to an episode of Sam Harris's podcast since I guess it's been like 2 years now when he made it so that
job. That's great.
So I was listening out of inertia just to like keep up with I was like, oh, this is probably a good way to keep up with what like the chuckle fucks in this sector of the world are listening to and thinking. But then he made it so that he was only dispensing the first 20 minutes or so of the episode. And
that's why you got to listen to Woking Up, because it'll keep you up with that.
That's actually like I've gotten to the point now where when it comes to like IDW people, I pretty much just listen to you and Jack and Daniel from like the I Don't Speak
Mm.
German pod.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much my digest of content from
Mm-hmm.
that sphere, because I was like, I trust the three of you to to do the job correctly, like even in places where I may disagree with you, like you in particular and Jack and Daniel, you all bring the receipts.
Mm-hmm.
So I trust you to be my information source
Mm.
on that. But that was an experience, that fucking episode. My God. I was not
Oh.
expecting my man to just be like, yeah, Joe Rogan's actually the cure for racism.
It was amazing, actually. He could, like, I mean, he is such a clown. It just amazes me. The cure for racism, and that there is absolutely no definition of racism that Joe Rogan could like fit into. Like just ridiculous things, look, ridiculous bold claims like that without anything to back them up.
That actually is a feature of Harris that I think is worth paying attention to. Is he is pretty much the embodiment of the no true Scotsman when it comes to whatever he's talking about. He's like, there is absolutely no example of X that would Y. And you're like, well, what about all these hundreds of examples of X that would Y? And he's like, well, those are crazy people. And
right.
like, you've been on the receiving end of that.
Right. Yeah, me
Yeah.
especially. I wonder why he doesn't like me. It's such a mystery.
Yeah. I mean, God, he's such an, and this is the part where I'm just going to like just lose all respectability. Like, I really just don't like the man. I think he's he's a 15-year-old's idea of what an intellectual is, and he
Exactly.
has absolutely no self-reflection of any kind. Or if he does, he's deeply cynical and misrepresents what he actually believes. He's either an idiot or a liar. I don't know which. And I cannot abide his bullshit. I
It's
don't know
just
how
so
you put up with it.
sad. Yeah, it's so sad that so many people do, though, right? Like that is the only thing that keeps me. Like I'm almost done with my mini series. I think I have one other larger theme that I want to hit, and then I'm just going to be kind of winding it down. And people have asked for a season 2, so I'll have to consider what I'm going to do in season 2. Maybe a different figure or something, or if I will do a season 2, we'll have to see. But yeah, it has been draining, let me tell you. Like, I haven't done podcast work that is that exhausting emotionally and mentally and just excruciating. But I think it needs to be done, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I want it to be there. Like, I want it to exist as documentation for people that may not realize just how bad he is.
Yeah, I think it's important because the thing that you do, and what I expect is probably the most tedious and emotionally exhausting thing, or one of them at least, is if you are a long-time Sam Harris listener, you will be familiar with the phenomenon of listening to this man drone about something to the point that, like, you know, this like dulcet like tone of like rational genius bro dispenser of like, you know, moral truth, and eventually it just sounds like microwave noises and static. And then like every once in a while he'll say some like absolutely bonkers shit like in the middle of
Yeah.
it, like all evidence, you know, every single neuroscientist on the planet agrees that you know, intelligence is primarily derived from genetics. And you're like, wait, what the fuck did you just say? And then he continues again, and, you know, you go back to sleep. And to put together why Sam Harris is such a piece of shit, you really need to identify and isolate all of those moments and put them together in a way that paints a coherent narrative that actually he is doing things with an agenda towards specific goals. And I cannot imagine how time consuming and tedious that is, but I'm very, very grateful that you're doing it because it is necessary. And God knows I couldn't do it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, hopefully more and more people continue to find it useful. That will make it worthwhile.
Yeah. What just like as kind of like a personal question, like what do you do to get through that shit? Because I know that has to be emotionally exhausting. Like, do you have like any tricks, or like if people wanted to listen to Sam Harris, like what are your coping mechanisms?
I mean, I guess I've become numb to it. Like I've heard this shit for so long, and also, I draw and just have creative outlets and do other things in between. So that helps.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of your work as far as my listeners might be interested in hearing the advertisement for. And I would now encourage everybody to go out and listen to the Polite Conversations podcast and the Woking Up miniseries if you want to know more about why Sam Harris is a giant fucking douchebag. And Eiynah, thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to plug your pluggables?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Nice Mangoes, no E in mangoes, and Patreon is Nice Mangoes too. And just look for Polite Conversations podcast on your podcatchers, and you'll find it. Woking Up is within the same feed.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's we'll just cut it there. Eiynah, thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was nice talking to you.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again, and thank you so much for listening, for watching. However you happen to get this content, I really appreciate it. And thank you once again, Eiynah, for coming on the show. If you would like to support me and what I do here, then you can do so directly financially by becoming a patron. That is at UltravioletPod. And you can also give me a one-time tip via Venmo, Coffee, PayPal. All of that is at UltravioletPod as well. And you should also, if you're able to, go out and support my guest who has a Patreon. And the links will be in the down there part for all of Eiynah's stuff. It definitely helps if the people that I interview get a boost from coming on my show, because that means I can get other guests. So that helps me too. And also, she does good work, and we like to support our friends who do good work. So definitely do that. If you are not able to support either of us financially, I totally get that. I understand. I've been there. You still can help support the show. You can subscribe to my channel on YouTube. You can hit the notification button so you make sure you always get notified. You can subscribe to the show on your podcast reader of choice. Give it 5-star rating. Leave a comment on iTunes or on YouTube. Engage with the content. It actually really helps with the algorithm to drive up that engagement. That puts me in front of more people, which brings in more viewers, which brings in more money ultimately. And hopefully we can eventually make this show a, if not profitable endeavor, then at least break even, which is my primary goal. So anything that you can do that will help me, I genuinely appreciate it. And anything that you can do to help my guests is also greatly appreciated. If you would like to engage with me directly on social media, I am active mostly on Twitter, at UltravioletPod, and I also have a Facebook and Instagram account, but I don't really post on those very much, but it's the same at. I'm also on Twitch very infrequently at UVPod, so if you want to randomly catch me streaming a game sometime, somewhere, maybe, go subscribe to that as well. And that's pretty much it. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.